I'd be happy to share them with you. And so just send me email and we'll get that in chat, but also SHERYLB at uw.edu. Again, Cheryl Bergstaller. Well, I'm joining you from Hawaii today, so it's noon here. Very warm. I don't know where you are, but it's kind of nice that we can be with each other, even though we're not even in the same location. One of the advantages of perhaps a pandemic. So we've had a lot of lessons we've learned, a lot of situations that are different. And I like to share a perfect personal story about the heartache and the warmth of the pandemic. And this is my mother, if you can see her through the middle. She's 96 years old in an assisted living facility where she's been pretty much quarantined there for a year. And this is my son to the left, Travis, and me, I'm on the right. And in the middle, the focus of our attention is our new baby. And she was born in August, Emerson Louise Bergstaller. And I guess the beauty of it is great grandma did get to meet her, but the sad part, of course, is she couldn't hold her. Hasn't been older yet, but we're hoping that that soon that might be able to happen. But there are all sorts of stories like that. I feel like someone should write a book just on these warm-hearted stories where we made things happen, even though they're not as good as they could be. So that's what we're here to talk about today, but in terms of online learning. About me, I direct 2 units in accessible technology services. That's my organization total, but there are 2 units within it. And one is the IT accessibility team. And this started in '84 with a different name and a much smaller group, but it's all about making sure that the IT that we develop, procure and use at the University of Washington is accessible to people with disabilities. That would be students, faculty, staff, and of course, visitors to our websites, etc. And so that's totally funded by the University of Washington. In the early days, we focused on a lot of assistive technology, but now more on the accessible design of websites and documents and software and guess what, online learning. But I also direct the Do It Center, which stands for Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking, and Technology. And in that center, which started in 1992, we bring in federal, state, corporate, and private funds to fund projects that are about making programs and resources and whatever life has to offer more inclusive of people with disabilities. And that again includes online learning. We actually have a program, Do It program in Japan, and we also run the Center on Universal Design in Education, which was funded in 1999 by the US Department of Education. So we do a lot of stuff. We have 2 basic approaches in everything we do. Especially in Do It, we work with students with disabilities, but some in ITAD as well. And then we're focused on self-determination, which is a broad term that describes all the skills and information and resources you need to be successful in reaching your goals. And so we work with students in that regard. And when we're working with faculty or staff or institutions, technology companies, we promote universal design, and I'll talk about that today as our framework for making online learning accessible to students with disabilities. We've all seen the headlines. Many of them are about K-12, but these are some ones that have appeared in the media. Failure in the virtual classroom. The results are in for remote learning and it didn't work. Students and teachers flunked remote learning. Teaching and learning after COVID-19. A lot of headlines. I think many of us at this conference have seen how we can offer effective online learning programs, but when people have had to throw their courses up in a matter of minutes, practically, we can see how people are getting examples of not the best online learning. So what happened in the pandemic? Well, our campuses had to pivot to mostly online courses and services nationwide, worldwide. Imagine all the thousands of courses that went from on-site to online in a matter of days. It increased the demand for accommodations by students with disabilities. And I'll talk a little bit about what those specific accommodations are, because sometimes in the press and reports of others think, well, this is great for people with disabilities because sometimes they have a hard time with transportation. They can stay home and participate online. Well, it depends on how accessible that online course is. There's a high demand and a high cost for these accommodations, and they're mainly to reformat course materials to make them accessible to students with disabilities. And so it's the materials themselves that online learning instructors are creating or using that create many of the accessibility problems. So here's just a 1-minute history lesson of the evolution of responses to human differences, including disability. Many years ago, hopefully, sometimes not so far in the past and even currently around the world, we treated them by eliminating them, by excluding them, by segregating them. So kind of keeping them away from other people with disabilities, other people without disabilities. Sometimes it was well-meaning people, parents that want to homeschool their children because they are afraid because of their disability, they'll be teased at school or bullied. And that's understandable, but also there's a loss in terms of what they can have access to in their school and in their community. And then in the middle of the last century, there's more of a focus on curing, rehabilitating, and accommodating, particularly after World War II. Many veterans returned from the war with multiple injuries. And we didn't have that in other wars because they didn't survive the injuries they had on the battlefield. So now we had medical attention that could be delivered to them, and they survived those injuries and came home, many of them with multiple disabilities. Then, of course, they received rehabilitation, and also they had the GI Bill. And so a lot of these veterans came to post-secondary education, knocking on our doors to be part of our educational programs. And so then became the big movement in accommodation because our campuses really weren't designed for them. Even people using wheelchairs didn't always have access to the buildings and so forth. And so that's been the approach, the framework that we've used in higher education and other online learning programs to adjust to students with disabilities in our classes. But now we're in a different era, and we know this in when we're dealing with other underrepresented groups, but the era of social justice. And you may not know, but people with disabilities had a disability movement for getting access to things and fair treatment, just like racial ethnic minorities and women that struggle with these things today. And so the logical then response to that is not just to accommodate them once they get there at our classes, but to think about them ahead of time and include them. And universal design provides a way to do that. So there are some legal bases here. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of '73, but also the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and 2008 amendments. And these two laws, as well as state and local and institutional policies, imply that any of our covered entities, which would include any online program that you're offering to the public, whether it's for a fee or not for a fee, needs to be accessible to people with disabilities in that public. And some people are surprised by that because 1973, we didn't even have online learning back then. Well, it's because these laws aren't about details on making things accessible. They're about civil rights. They're from the civil rights movement. And so this is about saying that people with disabilities have a right to enter and be full participants in courses and so forth. And so those apply to whatever technology we're using. So what are we looking for? Well, in an inclusive course, I would say my version would be that everybody who meets the requirements with or without an accommodation to participate. So including in your materials, if you're promoting a class, to say how a student can get accommodations is a good way to make a statement that I expect students with disabilities to be in these classes. Once in there, today, many who take online courses, these are presented with a syllabus as a first thing to look at, which is pretty common. And the syllabus is what is inaccessible to them. They can get an accommodation to remediate that syllabus, but they're not feeling welcome. If the very first thing they try to do, they can't even get access to what they're supposed to do in the class, let alone do it. And then everyone is fully engaged in an accessible and inclusive environment and with activities. So I think for most of us, we're not in a disability services office. We don't need to know the medical terms about disabilities and so forth. We should just think of all of the students in our class as being on a continuum when it comes to any ability, from not able to able. And all the participants in this presentation, for instance, would be on a continuum. You could rate yourself on understanding English. And sometimes we think about a disability that makes it difficult for someone to understand English, but it also could be that their first language is not English, and so they are English language learners. Social norms. Some types of disabilities make it difficult for someone to understand social norms, pick up social cues. But other people might have difficulty because they grew up in a different culture. Similarly, there are various reasons why someone might not be able to see. I'm not assuming everyone can see the PowerPoint slides today. And it may be because someone is blind is here in this session, but also it might be someone that's coming in by phone, or for some other reason they have the video turned off. And so you'll notice today that I'm applying an accessibility practice by that the key elements of what I'm talking about are spoken aloud. So the ability to see or hear or walk, read, print, to write with a pen or pencil, to communicate verbally, tune out distraction. How about the ability to learn or manage physical or mental health? You can probably think about some disabilities associated with these abilities. But the most important thing is everyone is on the continuum. And there's no really average person when you look at all of these different abilities together. Another thing to note is that most disabilities are invisible, meaning that they're just not obvious to people. Learning disabilities, attention deficits, and some other disabilities are not obvious to the casual observer. And it's also interesting to note that almost a quarter or a third of students with disabilities tend to report them to the Disability Services Office. This is a big surprise to many people, because I think when they get that letter from the Disability Services Office requesting accommodations for a particular student, they know all the students in their class who have disabilities, but that's not true. Why wouldn't they tell you or the school about a disability they have? They might be concerned that you may discriminate against them because of their disability, and they have a long history in that. And so they don't know you, and so they think, well, I'll just try to do this on my own. Some may just not think they need an accommodation. They might not even be aware of the types of things you're doing in your class. But anyway, the basic point between these first two things is you don't really know who has a disability in your class. But the only ones that benefit from accommodation are the ones that have gone through the Disability Services Office and requested accommodation. And so the Disability Services Office primarily offers accommodations after the inaccessibility is discovered. And so they don't tend to have a lot of time on their in their date book to help faculty create their courses more inclusively, although some of them definitely try to do that. So what kind of accommodations do students need? Well, there's extra time on tests and a lot of things. But hearing from the Disability Services offices on our own campus and others, the two that are the biggest issues as far as spending time and using staff time and online learning are the inaccessible design of documents and videos. And so for documents, it's mainly PDFs. PDFs can be made accessible, but they're difficult to make accessible. And so if you're interested in, investing some time in learning how to design an accessible PDF, then by all means do that. But there are different rules for a Macintosh and a PC. If you put your syllabus in a PDF and you want to edit it later, you can sometimes end up with difficulties and lose some of the accessibility. So you have to recreate it all over again. And if you want to remediate your inaccessible PDF, you do have to buy a special product from Adobe that I understand is about $100 piece of software to actually do. So I'm going to suggest, as you'll see in my tips, don't use PDF. Don't create PDFs if you don't want to mess with that. If you do, that's fine. Some people like to fool around with this stuff. But if you don't, there's no reason why you ever have to use a PDF. If you wanted to use a document for your syllabus and attach it, Microsoft Word, for instance, is likely how you created it. And so if you attach that document, and there's some accessibility things I'll talk about to think about even in Word, but that'll be accessible. And also just cutting and pasting the content of your learning management system pages is even a more accessible way for students to access that material. And then captioning videos. Some people are surprised by this because they'll say, well, I put my videos up on YouTube, they're all captioned. Well, yes and no. YouTube, like most systems for storing videos, will caption them, but it's a computer that's captioning them. And so we know computers don't always understand our voices perfectly. And so they're not captioned necessarily accurately. And we know that. A lot of funny stories go around about how certain words are interpreted by a computer. But what most people who post on YouTube don't know, just based on my viewing the videos and seeing the poorly worded captions, is that they're easy to edit. And so you should think of those captions as a draft. And so you need to get into the editing features of YouTube or whatever system you're using and put in the punctuation and correct the misspelled words. Because if a student needs an accommodation because they're deaf and need captions, they will have to be recaptioned by the Disability Services Office or edited captions in order for them to get that accommodation. Those computer generated captions are not good enough for an accommodation. And so you want to edit those. So rather than provide accommodations, we should be thinking about the design of the course or the product or the environment and making it accessible. So this is an image I like to show in a lot of my talks, but it is an example of to be just a poorly designed product. Coffee pot with the spout and the handle on the same, I think would not be considered a good design. But we also wouldn't try to modify it to use it. I think we would just say, well, wait a minute, let's start over and make a better coffee pot. And that's why we're talking about online learning. Let's look at the online learning course and see if we can improve the design before we just accept it as it is and just rely on accommodations. So that gets us to the definition of universal design. The design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And so this doesn't mean you can make everything perfectly accessible and never have an accommodation request, but there's a lot you can do to minimize the need for accommodations, to make it born reasonably accessible, so to speak. So this is from the Center for Universal Design. And so it's about any product or environment. And so if we're looking at online learning, we're just talking about the design of online learning products and environments and how we can make them as inclusive as possible without having an accommodation. So universal design has three characteristics. It's accessible. So that means technically accessible to a person with a disability. And so they can actually get access to that content in your syllabus, for instance. But it's also usable. Sometimes technologies in particular are developed that technically maybe a person who's blind or has another disability might be able to use it sort of, but it's not very usable for them. It's not easy to use. We've experienced that with software that we just can't figure out how to negotiate through the software and figure out what means what. And it's not maybe it doesn't have usability more appropriate for the public. And then inclusive, meaning that everybody uses the same product. It builds in features on accessibility. So the idea is like this Buddhist monk said, I don't think he was actually thinking about online learning, but I thought of universal design when I thought of this. Plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it's not doing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun. And so he was look at the environment that we're putting our students in and see how we might improve it. So if we have more universal design, then we would have fewer accommodations in the courses that we teach. And so in both of these images, in the first one, we have a large circle of accommodations within universal design because accommodations are part of universal design. But in this one, if we apply a lot of universal design, then that oval that the accommodations are in is much, much smaller. So universal design's been around a long time. Back in 1970, before they called it universal design, our first example of a universally designed feature that's been widely accepted is the curb cut in sidewalks. Some of you are too young to even remember when most sidewalks, almost all of them, did not have curb cuts. They did not have those little ramps built into them. And so here's a picture on the first day, or the first page of the Daily, which is a University of Washington newspaper, 1970. A young man, I assume a student, in a wheelchair, has on the back of his wheelchair a sign that says, "Ramp the curbs, get me off the street." And back in the 70s, many people thought that was not reasonable to put little curb cuts all over the place for a very small group of people that might use them. And we all know today that we just expect that there'll be curb cuts, and we're using them more often for baby strollers and delivery carts and skateboards and things like that than we are for people with disabilities. So universal design benefits everyone. If we take a look at a building, we have buildings, we've really used to having buildings that are accessible. And so you might have an entrance that has a couple of steps, and then next to it a small ramp. But a better design, one that's included, so I would call it universal design, is the one on the right, the image on the right, where we have a gently sloping wide ramp. That is the main entrance to the building. And everyone goes in the same way in the main entrance. So if I'm walking side by side with someone who's using a wheelchair, we can continue our conversation. Where in the typical ADA compliant one on the left, I would go up the steps probably, and they would go up the very, very narrow ramp that we couldn't both go up that way. By the way, the image on the right is in a building that has many steps in it. But the point is, the primary entrance, the main entrance, is the one that's most accessible. You can find the steps if you'd like to use them. So if we take a look at technology, our smartphones, we don't have to go any farther than that, where we have accessibility features that are actually built into it, where, we can have large print, we can change the background and color of the text. There's a lot of things that we can do that were features that at one time were developed for people with disabilities, mainly people who had visual impairments, but our phones can even talk to us. And so people who are blind can access phones. It's a great device for people who are blind. So what we're looking for in universal design is that kind of built-in accessibility, but also the second quality is it ensures compatibility with assistive technology. Assistive technology being devices that people with disabilities use to use the computer or get output, like a Braille embosser, for example. We're not going to have Braille on our smartphones, but we want to make sure that they could interface with one if one wanted to produce some material in Braille. So when we're developing a course, we want to consider the characteristics of the students who might enroll, not waiting until they enroll and think, oh, I got to fix things, but who might enroll in my class? And also think about the assistive technologies they might use. So I think of 4 people, I happen to know them: Anthony, Jesse, Adrian, Nicole. We don't have a long time to talk about assistive technology. It's a workshop in itself, very interesting, by the way. But Anthony has a physical disability and doesn't have a usable voice. But he has a specialized computer screen connected to his interfaces that with a phone, because he actually provides phone support using a computerized voice, people that want to buy technology, and so forth. The only thing you really need to know about Anthony is all this assistive technology. He can do anything that you and I can do using the keyboard, but he can't operate a mouse. And companies are developing software or even websites. We need to make sure that everything that we offer using that product can be accessed using the keyboard alone. You don't need to know about all the gadgets he's using, but again, you might want to. It's very cool. Jessie has multiple learning disabilities, and so she has difficulty getting content into the computer. She uses dictation software and out of the computer, and so she uses speech output as well that can read to her the content of documents and so forth. And so she wants to read something on a website using the voice output, because she can read so much better if she can hear it and see it. She needs to have access to that text. And so if it's just an image, she's not going to be able to use her screen reader assistive technology like she'd like to. Adrian's deaf, and so we need to make sure that things are accessible to him, and videos are captioned. And then Nicole, and she's blind, and she uses a Braille device, like I mentioned, but she uses a standard keyboard, but she too needs access to the text, like Jessie does, even though the disabilities are really different, but she needs some formatting that I'll talk about a little bit too. So if we take a look at the limitations of the assistive technology available to people with disabilities, rather than looking at all the gadgets, there are thousands of them, but think about how this might impact how we teach a class. The assistive technology might emulate the keyboard, but not the mouse, as I mentioned. So we design websites and software, whatever, to be able to be operable using the keyboard alone. They cannot read content presented in images. And so we need to make sure that we provide alternative text. And in your learning management system, you might be cued to put alternative text in for your images, like I would be with that coffee pot I used earlier. You just put enough information in there so that if someone can't see the image, they can get access to the content. I wouldn't say that it's red or anything. I would just say an image of a coffee pot with a handle and a spout on the same side. Some people have thanked me for my short, very concise, but specific alternative text, by the way. The screen reader that Nicole uses can tab from link to link on a website, but also from heading to heading in a document and read what the wording is there. And so that's why we need on our links within our management system, the content pages that we're filling up. If you're linking to something, that you put what you're linking to rather than click here. Because if a student, if you have a lot of links on a page and a student who's blind goes back to a lesson, thinks, I want to go back to that website that I went to and I can't remember what lesson it was in, they can skim through with their tab and read all the names of the links. So if they all say click here, they have to read every page, they have to read all the content on your page all over again so they can see the surrounding text and figure out what that link links to. So just say do it website instead of click here with that underlined text. And as far as headings in your documents, you need to provide some structure because again, a screen reader can say heading 1, this is the name of it, heading 2, heading 3, heading 3, heading 2. So they can understand the whole organization of a document by reading through the headings, like the rest of us might be doing who are not blind by just looking at them. And so if you're giving them a 25-page article to read, imagine how helpful it would be if they could read the headings and say, oh, I see, and also go back to that document and review the section that they found confusing. So that's important. And then we need to caption our videos, of course, and transcribe audio. And it doesn't just benefit people with disabilities. Taking a look at captions, for example, certainly it's for people that can't hear the audio because they're deaf or hard of hearing, but also it's really beneficial to English language learners. They often use videos that have captions if they're accurate to learn English, help them learn English. People who are in noisy environments like an airport can benefit from the captions, or a noiseless one, like in a room where the baby's sleeping, and you might want to just read the captions. And then you might have a slow internet connection, or for some other reason not using the image. And you might want to know the spelling of words. If you're giving a chemistry lecture, you certainly want to have the spelling of words correct. And those that want to search through those captions quickly, there are ways to search through those captions. So if there are a lot of videos in class, a student can find it. So in a nutshell here, there are 3 sets of principles that can guide applying universal design on a post-secondary campus or in an online learning program or whatever. And then the primary universal design principles, going back to the definition, are the principles of universal design. There are actually 7 of them. And then there are 3 principles for universal design of learning. Some people have learned those 3, and that's good. That's a good start. But it's important to add these last 4 too. And those are the guidelines or the principles that underpin the web content accessibility guidelines. And so, for instance, providing students multiple ways to learn, which would be an online universal design for learning principle, you need to make sure that the ways are accessible too. So if you're using a video and a handout, don't use a PDF inaccessible handout and an uncaptioned video, because you also want your students to be used to access both of them if they want to, if they find it's best to access both of those documents. But in a nutshell, there are just really 3 things you need to think about looking at all those principles that underpin those other types of universal design. And the first one's providing multiple ways for participants to learn and to demonstrate what they've learned. A second one is to provide multiple ways to engage. In my online courses that I teach, in my syllabus, I say, introducing myself, well, you can meet with me anytime. We can make an arrangement to meet one-on-one. We can use Zoom, which is what I prefer. I don't say that in the syllabus, though. I just say we can use Zoom, or we can use the bulletin board system in our learning management system, or we use email. And I ask them to choose how they'd like to correspond with me. And some people will choose email, and I think it's probably because they might be a little embarrassed about their spell checker, or they might speak slowly because of a disability. But the very point is that I don't need to know that. I'm just telling them that they can choose how they want to communicate with me. So that's important, multiple ways to engage, and ensuring that all the technologies, the facilities, the services, the strategies, all the things that we're doing in the course are accessible to individuals with a wide variety of disabilities. You don't really have to think about all of it. You can just focus on those 4 types of disabilities and go a long way. So I had the distinction of actually teaching an online course at the University of Washington. And a professor of Black history at Rochester Technology at the time. And Norm happens faculty and so forth. I was around, that didn't, I was going to have a good, just the other one was, how accessible could we make the request? We taught the course adaptive tech for people. There was no World Wide Web. So we used email, a discussion list for our communication. We used Gopher. Some of you might remember that, kind of an outline system that University of Minnesota created. We used Telnet for logging on to computer systems, and file transfer protocol to move files around. We spent a lot of time teaching them, the students, how to use these tools, by the way. Everything was in a text format. That's the way Gopher was. And then we actually mailed some things to the students, some publications, and captioned and audio described VHS videos that we had created in the Do It Center. And so we made it very accessible. No one had to ask for an accommodation. Sometimes they disclosed their disabilities, but it was probably because of the nature of our class. And so we thought, yeah, we can do this. And it's the same now. It's just that we have a whole bunch of different tools that in some ways make things easier, in some ways make things harder as far as accessibility. But it's basically the same idea. Just thinking of the broad range of people that might take your class, thinking about how you might keep things more inclusive for them from the get-go, and then relying on accommodations for more. So I did this document. Yes.
This is Heather. I'm sorry. Your audio is a little choppy, and we're wondering if maybe if you turn your camera off, if that might help a little bit.
Oh, that's probably a good idea. Okay.
Thank you.
So I created a handout with 20 tips for teaching an accessible online course. And you can get on our website, but if it's very popular, just go Google 20 tips space online, you'll find it. And so I created this for faculty and course designers who don't have a background in accessibility for the most part. Itself has references for how to do these things. And it was developed from a literature review of what other people had reported in the literature, like students with disabilities, what trouble they're having in online learning, and reports from instructors as well that were in the literature. And also we do a lot of programs for kids with disabilities. So I was just asking them all the time. So I came up with some of the things they talked about. Some students with disabilities, the biggest thing they complain about online learning is having clear, consistent layouts and organizational schemes. And learning from the pandemic here, I think that's one of the big issues for new instructors in online learning. And it's understandable because all the materials they had for class, they just started throwing it online. So then that's understandable, but need to go back and make things more organized and make it possible for students to move from page to page and so forth. Putting things in a text format and structure those headings, like I mentioned, and also structuring the lists. And so you use a structure for lists rather than putting your own little bullets one at a time. Describing the wording for hyperlinks. I mentioned why that's important. Avoiding PDFs if you want to. Certainly don't use scanned ones. Accessible HTML, that would be in your content pages is best. But again, if you want an attachment, you might want to use a Word. That's the only attachment I use in my entire online course that I'm teaching now. Because I put the content right the most ideal for all students, so they don't have to go to a link just to get the content. And so that's something that is fairly easy to do. Some faculty will say, well, what about those PDFs I linked to in my class? Some of those will be accessible and some not. And you can maybe take some effort to see if they are, but at least don't create new ones that are inaccessible. And then there are other documents like PowerPoints and Word and so forth that have accessibility features you might want to explore. Like this set of points, I made sure that it's in an accessible format. So large, bold, sans serif fonts, I'm demonstrating that today. Uncluttered pages, plain background, visual impairments, but also people with some types of learning disabilities and attention deficits. Kind of imagine for a minute if you have an attention deficit and seeing all this clutter on the screen and having trouble know what you need to pay attention to. High contrast color combinations. Avoid problematic ones for those who are color blindness is not a disability, but it's something to consider. Yellow red and green, I've heard, are the most problematic, and there are checkers that you can see, you can use, and they're linked to from the document to check. I actually recommend something different though, because you never know how the color is going to appear on someone's screen. And that is never require someone be able to understand the color. And so if you want someone to choose between a red button and a green button, those buttons a different shape. So you can say, choose the round button and the green square button. And so you have two ways to understand that button is. And by the way, there are ways to have alternative text so a blind person can figure that out too. Make sure the videos are captioned and audio described. If you have a lot of videos and some of them are for lectures, you might not have resources to caption all for a class, but at least make sure the videos you use in the first week or two are captioned. And then by that time, the student who needs captions at least has had time to communicate with the Disability Services Office and is already working on those other captions. Same with audio description. Avoid a large number of technology tools. I know there are a lot of people that love to use the greatest tools. Some students are not that comfortable using a lot of technology tools. And as far as accessibility, you're introducing accessibility issues more than maybe you need to. And so making sure they're accessible can be pretty tricky. You might need someone with technology skills beyond your skill set. But you can try things like trying it with a keyboard alone, that one, but also looking at the company website that created that product. Have a page on accessibility. They're trying to market that product, so it might not be real truthful, but if they don't have a page at all, you can be sure that they haven't thought much about accessibility. Address a wide range of technology skills. And so what I do in my class is I just simply point to resources on the very first day from the syllabus. If this is the first time you've used Canvas or Blackboard or whatever, here's a good place to get started. And people will say, well, but they know where all those resources are. Well, that's a problem. So many resources. You love a week or two, so you need to know how to do those resources. Start. Make sure the content presents. Collaborate. When I have a small group assignment, but they all agree on the method, and have to report that in the what method did you use to communicate to assure that everyone could communicate and why. And they don't have to disclose a disability, but they need to say, well, everyone agreed that they wanted to communicate elements by email, and the issue is usually their schedules, that they need something asynchronous. And so multiple ways to demonstrate what they've learned, and address a wide range in language skills using plain English. We're all comfortable with the subjects we teach, and so you kind of have to look back and try to be objective. Some of the words we use are things that other people might not be familiar with. When I'm talking about web accessibility, I often use the low-hanging fruit expression. My guess is most of you know what that means. But in my class, when I use it the first time, I say, if you haven't heard that expression, what I mean by low-hanging fruit is, and just in a few words, I can tell them what I mean by that. And so it's very, smooth. It's not singling anybody out, but also demonstrates being universally designed. And defining acronyms, that's probably one of the big complaints I have in presentations I go to at a conference like this, is people put up an acronym. And it's irritating if you don't know what it means. The message you're sending to your audience is, you don't belong in this session if you don't at least know that acronym. They should know that. And so, well, is that really what you want to say? Or could you just spell it out, please? Make sure that the instructions and expectations are clear. Again, that's one of the things that students with disabilities report. And sometimes it's related to their disability, that they have a hard time understanding things that aren't real concrete. So you don't need to lower the expectations of your assignment, but just make it really, really clear. Go over it many times to make sure it's clear to someone who's not all that familiar with the content in your course yet. Make sure examples and assignments are relative to a lot of different people. Provide outlines and other scaffolding, if that makes sense. If you're asking students to take notes in maybe lectures you're going to be giving, maybe giving them what good notes would look like for the first lecture. And again, I like the word scaffolding tool, because you'll take that scaffolding away and expect them to be able to do that on their own. But again, I don't think that that would lower the expectations of your class. Just make it available to more people. Provide adequate opportunities for practice. I think the best thing you can do there is make sure the assignments are described in your syllabus or in a document nearby. If they're described in detail, and students start working, and they can adjust their time based on when they're going to be on vacation or how much time they think that different assignments will take for them. And make sure there's adequate time for project activity projects and feedback on parts of assignment, along with corrective opportunities. I think we've all had an example of, if we've done much teaching, where somebody just totally missed what we asked them to do in assignment. And if we had just maybe had a few checkpoints away, even if they're optional, maybe it would have turned out better for that student. So design, an attitude, a framework, a goal, a process. It values diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can be used for a framework for designing our DEI efforts on our campuses. Promotes best practices, does not lower standards. It's proactive, can be implemented incrementally, benefits everyone or almost everyone, and minimizes the need for accommodations. So for me, it's just a matter of good teaching, and good teaching is always just good teaching. So I have a list of resources up on the screen now, where the first one is the Center for Universal Design and Education, and these URLs will be in the chat. And along with that is a book that I recently published called Creating Inclusive Learning Opportunities in Higher Education, a toolkit. And so a lot more about this. We also have a web page that's called Access DL, Access Distance Learning. That includes the 20 tips. So you can just go to that URL. And then Access Computing focuses more on the technology and computing in general, like getting access to computer science courses, etc. And then you can send me email, again, CherylB@UW.edu. And you might want to join our Universal Design in Higher Education community practice, or Access DL online community of practice, if you want to discuss some of these concepts more. So we have, and so you can put your questions in chat, and we can get started and see some questions you would like me to ask.
I have a question for you, Cheryl. This is Heather. What should somebody do just to get started with all of this?
Oh, that's a good question. I get asked that all the time. Because you look at these 20 tips, distilling it down to a short list like that. What I do if I teach workshops, go through the list and mark the things you're already doing, and then choose one thing that you'll do. Whether it's organizing your materials letter up updating your syllabus or, changing your, not using the PDFs anymore, just take one thing and then just do that. And when you have some time, try doing anything. It's a nice thing about universal design. You don't have to do it all at once, at one time. You can see the URLs in the chat, so be sure to grab hold of those. We have a lot of online resources that can be a benefit to you. So you want to add what is something. I am on a kind of I like to use the expression, never lose your capacity for outrage. So I'm outraged that the syllabus of many of our online courses are not accessible to students with disabilities. So that's a good place to start. And as I mentioned before too, think about the beginning of your class. Like you might be starting the class next week. That's the first week or so. Could you employ some of these tips for that? So we're not getting a lot of questions, but I assume that's because I just explained everything so well, wouldn't you think? But we do have time for one more question, probably, if someone has one. So I'm hoping that you enjoy the conference as much as that I have. I've gotten a lot of good tips from other presentations on things to use in classes, and I've made some little notes, and I'm just going to go and see how accessible they are. And I'd like you to join me in that effort as well. So thanks for your interest and hanging out for the whole presentation. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Cheryl. I also added the link in the chat if anyone wants to fill out the survey for the session. And we do have a hard stop at 4:50. So if this closes out on you, I apologize, but make sure and take down the presenter's email if you want to reach out to her.
That's right. And remember, I can send you these PowerPoints. Use them if you want, as long as you give credit to the source. I don't want people to think that I stole them from you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it out now. Thank you again.